32 years. Prior to moving around, including 10 years in Madison, Wisconsin. Tony and I, let me share my screen. Tony and I thought it was a great idea to do this together. And we've had a great time, I think. At least I think we have. Hopefully
Yep.
she agrees.
True story.
And we're looking forward to presenting some things tonight, not as experts, much as Danielle mentioned when she did her forum. We're interested people. We're people who are trying to educate ourselves over the last year in our racial justice group with Midvale. And it's been an interesting journey. And I would say, I think we both agree that there have been numerous times where someone has said to us, or we have said, oh, I had no idea, no matter what we were talking about. So we're looking forward to what we'll discover tonight. One thing we wanted to put out to the group was just thinking about putting in the back of your mind the question, what does voting mean to you? What does it personally mean? What is, do you vote without fail? Do you vote just when it's, easy for you? Have you run into troubles when you haven't been able to vote? Just what does voting mean to you? Kind of keep that thought in your mind, and we're going to discuss that later. I found some interesting pictures you'll hopefully enjoy throughout. You'll see to the left an engraving of kind of old traditional, well, pre-photography voting, where you see the usual crowd you'd expect in the late 1800s voting. The center photo is from the 60s, civil unrest period. And then on the right is the women's suffrage. Sometimes I forget that there was a day where I wouldn't have been able to vote. So my part, the first part, is going to be laying out some brief history, some interesting facts in our time together. And it's not going to be a conclusive, all-inclusive history, but I want to go over a few things that interested me. One, I wanted to look at facts about Reconstruction and how it laid out the foundation for the Jim Crow era. I wanted to look at the Voting Rights Act. I mentioned, I think all of you were here when I said I've been all about this LBJ biography. And I really wanted to know what was the deal with the pressures that pushed him to sign that, create and sign that Voting Rights Act. I had fun getting a lot of photos. I wanted to look at those, and then I wanted time for us to talk with each other about this history and how it affected us and our politics today. The photo you see on the left is that apparently they're not able to identify the location, but it's a Baptist church. 1948, people lined up waiting to register to vote. So Reconstruction, I certainly knew the word, had to memorize it in school. Again, I was born in 1952. So this, I learned a certain way. I grew up in Pennsylvania. And first of all, 1865, of course, the end of the Civil War, and the 13th Amendment which took a year to be ratified, freed the slaves. But of course, then what do we do about a bunch of freed slaves? These bullet points are really just observations from looking pretty in-depth research on Reconstruction. So you had to have all these Confederacy states join the Union, but what do you do about all these free people now? So it appeared to me in my reading that the period of 65 to 77, there was just a lot of government chaos to figure all these things out. For example, the Reconstruction Act of 67, that set up the terms by which each state needed to rejoin. So each one individually, I hadn't thought about that, but whatever year this state could come on. And then, okay, now you get to come on because you'll fulfill these benchmarks to rejoin. I also read a little bit about Andrew Johnson, and wow, he doesn't seem to be one of our best presidents. He had quite the rocky road during this time period. And then the other thing that stood out was this compromise of 1877, which resulted from a contested election. And it removed, the thing that stuck out was it removed federal troops from 3 states in the South. So that kind of set an example that we'll see again and again in our history, where we kind of cater to the southern states. We sort of give in order to get something else. So once these troops were removed, then other things happened. So these were kind of my takeaways from Reconstruction. One thing I did learn that I wanted to share with you, I actually learned from Charles Blow. He's an op-ed columnist with the New York Times. A couple weeks ago, I happened to read a column on, not on voter suppression, but it talked about Mississippi history. And I had never heard of the Mississippi Plan, but I learned quite a bit. So one thing he pointed out that was an eye-opener to me was, and I'm looking at my tablet to read some quotes to you, during the beginnings of Reconstruction, Mississippi became a Black power center in the country. There were not only more Black people than white ones, there were also more registered Black voters than white ones. So this would be right at the beginning of Reconstruction. Mississippi elected hundreds of Black politicians and gave the United States its first 2 Black senators. I never knew this. So this is an engraving, first colored senator and representatives in the 41st and 42nd Congress. So you can imagine how well this went over with people in power in Mississippi. So the white Democrats at the time came up with something called the Mississippi Plan. That was the name of it. And basically it was just a plan of intimidation, violence, murder, to get back control of the government. They had groups like the Red Shirts. They had all kinds of intimidation and contested efforts to, and you can see in this photo, this is a group of delegates now that they finally built up their power and got rid, that, remember I mentioned about the federal troops leaving the South. Once they left, they built up even more power to rewrite their own constitution. And so here we have this group in 1890 meeting as a delegation, and they had a majority. They had the white supremacists, although a majority of the state is still Black at this point. They allowed only 1 Black delegate to this delegation, and they passed the entire Constitution without any public vote. This Constitution included poll taxes and literacy tests, some of the 2 favorite tactics used during this time period. So I found that very, very interesting. This is a piece from our National Archives, a poster from that era. And they did actually embed all these things into the Constitution. And then really, most importantly, they became a role model for other states, especially South Carolina. They really set up a system very much to this. So this, whoops, where's my, yeah. This also led to the Jim Crow era, and really set up a period of which I'm sure many of you are familiar. I'm gonna kind of jump from this point with the Mississippi Plan to another time period I wanted to think about, which is the 1960s. So at this point, I am now, I was born in 52, so I'm like 10 years old in this period, all up through high school. So I'm remembering, and I think some of you do too, this period of time. And this is a wonderful picture. I'm sure you know, recognize who this is. And the thing I want to talk about is the general civil unrest and the pressures that put on the government at the time. Biggest thing that it started with was World War II. And many Black people, of course, were involved in the war and gave their lives for it, and then came back to a country that really hadn't changed all that much. So that caused a lot of problems, naturally. Other things that happened at that time period was the Emmett Till open casket, the Emmett Till murder, and then the publicity of his mother deciding to keep that open casket. I read quite a bit in the Caro book about that and the impact that had in the Northeast. Caro seemed to think that such papers as the New York Times, all the major papers of the time, rarely published anything about civil unrest in the South. They didn't really report much on what was going on with poll taxes and so on. It was he said it was sort of oh, that's just those people in the South, whatever. But when that photos of that casket came out, it was just a real wake-up call for the Northeast intellectuals. And another thing that he talked about as having a huge impact was Martin Luther King, who was the first really articulate promoter of civil rights. He was able to speak to a variety of people. He was the first person that Black people had throughout the South to represent them. And he could speak to the intellectuals of the time in a very charismatic way. So he had a huge impact, and TV and photography that was pushing that. So I found those really interesting effects. And so I put this in because this is where I live now, Rochester, New York. Although it's not directly related to voting suppression, this era of riots happened many places in the 60s, and Rochester was really one of the first places. It was 1964. Shortly after that, the Detroit riots happened. But this area is, and I like one of the oral histories I read where they referred to this as Rochester Racial Justice Histories more than Frederick Douglass, who is buried here and is very much looked up to as a hero, as he should be. But in 1964, there were 3 nights of rioting. 4 people died, 800 plus people were injured, and it really shook Rochester. Up until then, people were able to say, oh, those people, they live over there, fine. But then those people just kind of got fed up. It had to do with housing, but this was happening all over the country and was a pressure to this voter suppression. I moved here in 1970 to go to college and stayed until 2003. And now here I'm back this year. And I could see the results of the riots and now still see the effects, but they're working slowly on these things. Good things have happened, but there's still work to be done on what really these neighborhoods that Rochester is left with. Another thing I found really interesting, more about voter suppression, was an oral history on Fannie Lou Hamer. I found this in the National Geographic. This was 1962, Indianola, Mississippi, and Hamer attempts to register to vote. And I'll just read you a couple sentences from the history. When Fannie Lou Hamer went to a county clerk's office in Indianola, Mississippi to register to vote in 1962, she was told to write an essay about a section of the Mississippi State Constitution. That was impossible, she recalled in an oral history recorded by the University of Southern Mississippi. I didn't even know what it meant, much less how to interpret it. Hamer was then threatened with arrest on her way home, and when she got there, her landlord told her to withdraw her voter registration or get out. I had to leave the same night from where she was staying. So that was really a powerful piece of oral history, I thought, from the time. So next, I wanted to just touch on what preceded the 65 voting rights bill. Here you see the headline, Johnson signs voting rights. 4 suits will challenge poll tax. There were a lot of things that pressured Johnson, although he had an interest all his life in a slight interest. He was interested in becoming president, but like a lot of politicians, it's complex. And desires and interests intersect at the right time. And this was one of those moments. And he had been affected. His first job coming out of college in Texas was teaching very, very, very dirt poor Mexican children who didn't even have a teacher. And he kind of whipped them into shape. It was an interesting part of that book. And it kind of stuck with him. So he did have that interest, but the things that really affected the voting rights bill was the impact of the JFK assassination. He was thrown into this, being president, and he was thrown into it after a guy that was like totally charismatic. And everyone loved him. They adored his wife. And of course, it was an awful, horrific thing. So here he was with about 9 months to go until he was going to run for president again, trying to get it together. He had a lot of pressures from the Southern Bloc. Most of you may know that he was the majority leader in the Senate for years. And one of his skills was knowing who was going to vote what. He collected votes and he knew how to control what was going on in the Senate. And he knew about the Southern Bloc, meaning the groups of Southern senators that mainly controlled what bill was seen and what wasn't. And then he also had this civil unrest that I had just showed you. So it was, when I read about things like that, I think, wow, how do you even get up in the morning? But he was pretty amazing, juggling all these things. So he had the 24th Amendment to deal with. That actually had passed, the House had passed that in 1962. So that would be Kennedy's time. And then it took until 64, after Kennedy had been assassinated, for it to be ratified. This abolished poll taxes, this amendment, and it also gave the feds, it was for federal offices, anyone who was going to run for a federal office. But as we see in this next one, until they passed that, at that point, the reason they had to outlaw poll taxes was there were still 5 states that had it, which kind of blew my mind. And I love these. There's a whole bunch of these in our archives that you can find on the internet. All these little poll tax receipts from different states, which just, here we got the Louisiana on the top and then Texas on the bottom. This just, I know I've heard of poll taxes, but to see these documents just kind of blew my mind. And you can read the states right there that still had this poll tax enacted. So the actual Voting Rights Act this, when he signed this, this was federal legislation that was implemented to protect voting rights, some voting rights that were already in place, but it also suspended literacy tests. It also, which is very important for thinking about our contemporary situation now, it also provided federal approval of proposed changes to voting laws or procedures in voting laws for states who previously had used a lot of these strategies, the poll tax, the literacy test, and so on, to limit registrations. So that was the key thing that happened that's my takeaway from this. And reading about it, guess what? It seemed to have worked. There were a lot of statistics I read showing, populations, Black and white, and the disparity in registrations. And by the late 1800s, that disparity, 1980s, by the 1980s, the late 1980s, that disparity in the registration had mostly disappeared. So it's quite, I was really kind of overwhelmed with this sweeping history that I went over in the last few weeks. So we've posed to you that question about what does voting mean to you? As we wanted to make the questions really personal, so we would have something to think about and talk about. I mean, maybe there's some of you that don't vote, but I'm betting many of you do. And then one I thought of was, what memories of voting in that April 2020 primary during COVID restrictions can you share? Because that felt kind of weird, that whole election. And then another thing to perhaps think about is, were you affected by riots or racial unrest in that time period of the 1960s? So Mark, let's go to breakout rooms. Okay. We had some good discussion going on. Mostly about, we did a lot of talking about the good old April primary, which I think we agreed, and I thought that was, considering right now we're all here, we're all white people. We can only begin to project what it might feel like, but there was a lot of angst over that April primary and absentee ballots, and would they be counted or wouldn't they be, and will my vote be counted? And yeah, that was good. So Tony, what's going on? You're on mute. There you go.
Yeah, I'm off. We never got that far. We just talked about what our view of the right to vote was. We never got to any of the other questions.
Oh, excellent.
But everybody, we interestingly had Mats in our group who talked about voting as a dual citizen.
Ah.
And he mentioned the US has this low voter turnout, and that there's a lot of reasons for that, right? But we never got past the what is
well, that's good. That's good. That's great. Yeah, well, we did learn that Ben's grandfather wore a suit when he voted. It was an important event. You were expected to vote, and he got out his suit. It must have been quite a sight to see. It was awesome.
And weddings and funerals too.
Weddings, funerals, and voting. That's when he got his suit out. So
not my graduation or anything.
No.
But I didn't make the top 3.
I want to just go back to what Matt said about in Sweden, the press was all concerned that they were going to get maybe less than 80% of
Oh,
the people
geez.
voting. Wow. Turned out that they had 84%. Shame on those 16.
Yeah, wow. Yeah, that's a huge amount for us here. Interesting. So Tony, you starting now?
Yeah, I'm gonna do something. I'm gonna put something in the chat for our breakout session, and as soon
Oh,
as
okay.
I stick that in there,
Oh.
I will go ahead and get going.
Okey-doke. So yeah, remember I ended folks with that, you know, if you're not familiar, I wasn't super familiar, I have to admit, about the 65 Voting Rights Act and that provision that the feds would keep an eye on these certain states and make sure they were following all the rules. And
Okay, so don't
so now
talk about all my
Tony,
stuff.
yeah, now Tony is going to be, we're going to be segueing to Tony's discussion. That's where they connect.
All right, so I'll go ahead and share my screen
Yep.
now. Okay. Am I in the slideshow yet? No,
Not yet.
here we go.
Yeah.
All right, is there a way to make, well, I can change my view here. All right. Oh, I'm not on the right slide. Hang on a minute. All right, so my job is to talk about present day voter suppression and from a racial justice perspective. And to do that, we have to talk about the thing that Ruth ended with and the Voting Rights Act. And the Voting Rights Act, as she said, required certain jurisdictions with a history of voter discrimination to submit any voting laws that they wrote to either the U.S. Department of Justice or to a District of Columbia federal court to ensure that the proposed change in voting law does not harm minority voters. And that was actually drastically changed by the U.S. Supreme Court in the case of Shelby County versus Holder. And what they found was, SCOTUS found that they struck that provision of the Voting Rights Act, which was like the meat of the Voting Rights Act. They struck it down because they said that it was unconstitutional because it was based on an old formula. Now, before those of you who are lawyers jump on me, I have to make my disclaimer that I am not an attorney or a voting expert, either one. I just am really interested in this whole area. But when Shelby County was addressed, these states, the dark red states, were totally covered by this review of their voting laws, and the bright red states were had counties that were covered, and then Michigan had some townships that were covered. So if you look at those dark red states and you think about some of the voter suppression laws that are coming out, where are they coming from now? They're coming from Arizona, they're Texas, Georgia, there's all kinds of them, and they're coming out of the places that don't have to get scrutinized anymore, which is pretty telling. The other thing I want us to talk about and think about is there are all kinds of voter suppression tactics out there, and I've got a list of them here, and they're all in the chat. And one of the things that we need to think about, because this is a racial justice presentation here, is are these tactics being put in place because of partisanship, or are they being put in place to suppress minority vote? Or is suppression of minority vote just a consequence of any of these actions? So I've got the list here. We're gonna next go to a breakout again, so you get to go back in with everybody. And I'd like you to consider which ones do you think of these are the worst, which might be occurring right here in Wisconsin, and which ones truly harm minority voters. So Mark, if you could put us in breakouts, and we're going to try and go for about 8 minutes, okay? All right, are we all back? Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, and we'll keep going. I hope everybody had a good discussion of all those things we're going to talk about. The list that is really specific to Wisconsin, a little bit more in depth. Okay, I'm back. All right, gerrymandering or redistricting. I think after Shelby County versus Holder, gerrymandering in Wisconsin is one of the most significant impacts on people's ability to vote, and has the most significant potential to harm minority voters of any of them. And I'm gonna explain why, and this is my opinion. So in 2010, there was an election, and that was when Scott Walker got elected, and the Republicans gained a majority, and there was a census. And so it was time to, they were allowed the ability to reshape the districts for voting in Wisconsin. And that process took place in 2011. The Republicans met in secret in a room across from the Capitol in that big glass building in the law offices of Michael Best and Friedman, and they called the room the map room. And a couple of their legislative aides, I can't remember, one of them was Todd Ottman, and I can't remember the other guy's name, but I know Todd Ottman because he was the youngest son of my husband's parents' best friend. So, but anyway, he was always kind of a family outcast, and now I know why. But anyway, they met and they drew maps, and they drew maps, and they drew maps to see how they could still meet the qualifications of appearing to be sort of fair, but still give the Republicans the best advantage they could. And once those maps would be in place, if they drew the maps right, they would keep their majority because the maps wouldn't get redrawn again until 2020. Now, is this a racist thing? Well, it could have been. It was quite clearly partisan. I don't think they were necessarily thinking or targeting minority voters when they were drawing the maps, but other people might believe they were. Can't get my thing to advance here. Sorry, my slide won't go forward. There we go. All right. It doesn't want to stay there. Hang on. All right, so what is gerrymandering? So when you draw these legislative voting districts, the idea is to draw a fair map. You take a sample of the population, say, and on the left, you've got a square. It's got 100 people in it. 40 of them are orange, 60 of them are purple. And then to draw a fair map, when you draw the voting districts at the end of the redistricting, you should have the same 40, 60, 40% of the voting districts should be orange leaning and 60% should be purple leaning. And that's what that right map shows. Okay. If you want to draw a partisan map, and the folks in the map room did want to do that, you could look at the map on the left, and that is about as partisan as you can get. The poor orange people have no districts where they're going to have a voter outcome in favor of the orange candidates. None. That's egregious. The second one has one districts where they say, okay, these guys are going to vote for the orange people no matter what. So we're give them their own district and let them vote, but we're going to dilute out their vote with 4 other districts that are most likely to vote purple. And so again, that would be pretty extreme. 80% of the candidates the elections would result in a purple outcome. Did this happen in Wisconsin in the map room? Well, these are some of the things they did. Did anybody watch Mapped Out? It was a Wisconsin Public Media podcast series and documentary that talked about how the maps were drawn. It's really, really interesting. And this material mostly comes from there. DeForest, with a population of 10,000, not really in any danger of throwing any presidential elections or anything, right? DeForest was divided into 4 different assembly districts. I mean, why? I don't know. They were only divided that way to benefit other districts where they wanted to add people a little bit here and a little bit there. Basically, those 4 districts now have no political clout whatsoever. I don't know how DeForest usually votes. I don't know. But where they used to be pretty much their own district, now they're divided into quarters, and that process is called cracking a district. Milwaukee County, on the other side, is a huge county, right? And it has a big population, and it had city of Milwaukee districts that were peeled off from their usual neighbors, neighboring blocks and neighborhoods that usually voted Democrat, and they were recombined with areas west of them, like into Menominee Falls, for example, that were more heavily Republican leaning. And so they ended up losing their political voice, the people that were moved into those districts and combined with highly likely to go Republican. Suddenly they had representatives that did not represent their concerns, did not, one of the people on the podcast described how, and she was a Black woman, how her representative, she had always supported the Milwaukee Public Schools. Well, her representative was out for privatization, private schools and vouchers and all that. And the support for the Milwaukee Public Schools changed drastically after this. That didn't meet her needs at all. Eau Claire used to be in 4 different districts, and its maps were redone in such a way that the 4 districts had always voted as swing districts. When it was a Democratic year, they voted Democratic. And then, the power shifted and swung, and those 4 districts would vote Republican. They really were closely divided 4 districts. What ended up in Eau Claire is kind of like that one map we saw where all the orange people were put into one place. The Democrats were put into one of the districts, and the other 3 districts were drawn to benefit Republicans. And that's called packing, when you put all of one type of voter into one district, and you say, okay, good enough, they can have their vote, but we're going to dilute them out with these other 3 districts. In 2012, in the national election, Obama won. It was a Democratic year, and the Wisconsin vote was greater than 50% Democrat in numbers. However, in the Wisconsin Assembly, 60 of 99 Republican candidates won. So this is what the maps looked like. Did they work? Yes, they did. And they guaranteed a Republican majority for the next decade or 12 years. If you look at where we are by district, by assembly district, a very red state now. So that opened the door for Wisconsin to do all kinds of other things to voting laws to restrict voting. As far as gerrymandering, where we are now in 2021, well, 2020 was it was a census, such as it was, but it was a census. And after the census, the Republican majority got together and drew maps again and kept right on their merry way of making the majority even more solidly cemented by the new maps. And Governor Tony Evers vetoed the bill that they passed supporting their new maps, which of course led to a legal fight. We do so much of our governing in court now. It's just crazy, but he vetoed, and eventually the Wisconsin Supreme Court had to rule. And on November 30th, the Supreme Court ruled that the maps should be redrawn using a least change methodology. So they didn't rule that the maps were being unfairly partisan. They ruled that they just shouldn't change very much. You should use a method to produce a very little change in the districts as they were. And they further said that, hey, look, this is a politically unfair map that's a political problem and should be resolved in the political arena. It should not be resolved in court. It's not our problem. Don't bring us these things anymore, kind of idea. So that was this latest round of gerrymandering. And I thought I was done with gerrymandering until I got the paper this morning, and the headline was Governor Evers draws new maps. So we're still at it. He is proposing even lesser lease changes, but the maps that he is proposing now still preserve the Republican majority, but not to the extent that the Republican ones did. So there will be some more fussing about this, and they'll probably just ignore him. Let's talk about some of these other things. Voter ID laws. We talked about this in the breakout session I was in. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, is a group that introduces model legislation for, and it's a conservative group, for states to adopt. And they proposed a voter ID legislation. And that was put forward by several Wisconsin legislators, but they went further. They wanted to adopt a voter ID law, basically, which is the ALEC model, but they also added a requirement that driver's licenses or voter IDs in Wisconsin had to include the voter's current address, even if the driver's license wasn't expired, so I get a driver's license for 6 years, right? If I'm an apartment dweller and I move every year to a different apartment, I would have to go back and get a new driver's license every year. And that would really pose barriers for minority voters, students, low incomes, individuals. And if your driver's license or your voter ID did not match, then you couldn't vote. So the Wisconsin law, of course, went through numerous lawsuits, but it was upheld in the end. And we do have a voter ID requirement. If you get a pure voter ID without a driver's license, it is free, but you still have to get to a local DMV and get it. And sometimes it's really hard. One of, I think it was Marty in our breakout session, said he didn't know if there were any individuals that were actually affected. I did read of one man and I just read of this one man, and there could have been more, but he moved here from Illinois. He tried for months to get a voter ID here. And the problem is in one of his documents, it might have been a birth certificate or something, and it was from Illinois. They incorrectly listed his middle name as Junior. He was like Bill Smith Jr., right? So he was listed as, and none of his other documents had Junior as his middle name. So he finally, after spending something like $2,000 trying to make this happen, he finally gave up and moved back to Illinois. So that was definitely an instance where it affected him very adversely. Studies by, this was published in The Nation. The study was done by Priorities USA, and they used pretty decent methodology to do their study. They looked at the 2016 election, and it showed that Wisconsin's voter ID requirement reduced voter turnout by 200,000 votes, and it disproportionately affected Democrat leading voters and African-American voters. So that's voter ID. Voter registration purges. The Wisconsin Institute for Law and Liberty sued to require the Wisconsin Elections Commission to use data from the electronic registration information to flag voters who might have moved and remove them once they identified them from the voter list within 30 days. And there were supposed to be letters sent asking you if you moved or not. And if you didn't respond, then you could be removed from the list. Well, the Wisconsin Supreme Court ruled in April of this year that the Wisconsin Elections Commission is not required by Wisconsin law to purge voters from the voting list, but that responsibility lies with municipal clerks. And if that lawsuit had been upheld, 234,000 plus voters would have been removed from the voter registration list. And what happens? You think you're registered to vote. Maybe you didn't vote in the last couple of years. You go to vote and you find out you're not on the list. and you're not registered and you can't vote that day. You have to go through the process of getting registered. And there was a study done by several Ivy League universities that found that the ERIC data erroneously indicated that minority registrants may have moved and when they hadn't. And that rate was more than, that error rate was more than double that of a white registrant. So it's definitely had a racial impact. I'm going kind of fast because we're getting on in our time here. Can people with felony convictions vote in Wisconsin? Yes, they can. If they have completed their sentence, they completed incarceration, all probation, and any period of parole or extended supervision, they can vote in Wisconsin. It's postulated that felons just think they can't vote. And the other thing that doesn't happen in Wisconsin, like it does in all the surrounding states, when felons complete all those requirements, they are automatically given the right to vote again. Not in Wisconsin. We require that they have to register to vote using a voter ID, right? to vote. We make it pretty hard for felons to vote. We don't automatically do it. And then if you look at what the racial impact of that law is, 1 out of 9 African-American voters is disenfranchised as a result of that law. We've all heard before of how African-Americans are charged with felonies in a really disproportionate way as compared to white voters. And this impact on voting is 1 out of 9 African-Americans versus 1 out of 50 white Wisconsin voters. So let's look at what's coming down the pipe here for changes to Wisconsin voting law. It's not stopping, it's only getting worse. One of the recently, the Republican legislature passed 10 different measures to restrict voting in Wisconsin, to affect voting in Wisconsin, I should say. One of the changes, several of the changes had to do with nursing homes. During COVID, the Wisconsin Elections Commission suspended the requirement that voting monitors who were trained had to come into the nursing homes before absentee ballots could be distributed in the nursing homes to ensure that the nursing homes had the proper procedures in place. And the new laws being proposed are that they want to end a voter ID. This is, I wrote this wrong. Currently, voter IDs are not required for indefinitely confined voters if they get a witness signature that verifies who they are, so they don't have to go to the DMV and get a voter ID if they're indefinitely confined. And then they're proposing to make it a felony to falsely represent yourself as indefinitely confined, or to be a felony to affirm someone else's indefinitely confined status falsely. And they're also proposing to make it a felony for nursing home or assisted living staff to influence a resident's vote. Now, have you looked at who works in nursing homes and assisted living lately? there are a whole lot of minority workers in there. And there's yet another felony that they can be charged with for influencing voting, which is, who's going to figure that out? I don't know who's going to decide. They want to limit communities to a single absentee ballot drop-off box, and it has to be in close proximity to the clerk's office. And they want to bar the Wisconsin Election Commission from automatically sending out absentee ballot applications or absentee ballots to voters. They want people to figure out how to apply themselves and not send out applications. And they don't want absentee ballots automatically sent out. All these and several other proposed changes were vetoed by Governor Evers in August. But wait, we're not done yet. On November 19, 2021, there was a New York Times article that stated that Wisconsin's become a nationwide incubator for conservative ideas, especially voting rights ideas, to be exported to other states because of our conservative record and likelihood to keep it. The current push, recommended by Ron Johnson, is for legislation to dissolve the Wisconsin Election Commission, which was created by Republicans in the first place, and for Wisconsin Republican legislators to exert unilateral control of federal elections here, because Democrats are widely known to cheat. That's what Ron said in an interview. And Racine County Sheriff is pushing for felony charges for 5 of the 6 Wisconsin Election Commission members on evidence-free grounds of voter fraud committed in nursing homes for lifting the requirement to send in these special voting deputies into the nursing homes before issuing absentee ballots during the pandemic lockout period. That he thinks they should be charged with felonies for doing this. And if you don't believe there is a pandemic, I guess you would think this was a good idea. I don't know. Assembly Leader Robin Voss agrees that such charges may be in order. And laws have been brought forward by the Republicans thus far. So what can we do? There is a group called the Wisconsin Interfaith Voter Engagement Campaign, and Ben Kempinen gets these. He's our church's main contact, and he will forward it to you if you want to get them. And the WIVAC is a joint effort of the Wisconsin Faith Voices for Justice and the Wisconsin Council of Churches, and their material is comes out weekly and is excellent. They right now, our federal senators are, we should be lobbying them to pass the Freedom to Vote Act and the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. And there's a planned big push to lobby for those things on MLK Day, January 17th. Is it the 17th? And those acts, if enacted by Congress, would ensure that all these local changes can't be put in effect for federal elections, which would be a really good thing. And the other thing you can do, that one of the Wisconsin Assemblyman, Joe Sanfilippo, demanded the resignation of 5 members of the WEC plus their staff, plus and possibly pursuing criminal charges against them for good faith actions they took to keep Wisconsinites safe during the early days of the pandemic. So whoopsie. Are you guys gone? There we go. So I'm done. We're really close to the end of our time. Do we have any discussion?
Well, our breakout group Ben had brought up the Ron Johnson, that mess. Being a role model for other.
Yeah,
That's a really interesting, wrinkle. And I was getting hopeless, but Ben said there's always hope. So,
I'm really glad this presentation is done because every time I read, there's more horrible stuff going on. It's just terrible.
One of the things that I talked to our group, and I maybe alert people, and I think one of the things that clearly is more of a partisan than a racial thing, but it certainly embraces both concerns, is in some of the states, they're not only putting up all these obstacles to voting, but they are firing all the basically nonpartisan election officials that they've had and creating new partisan commissions that would have unprecedented authority without any proof of irregularities to declare an election, basically invalid, and then substitute the state legislators' determination of who should be viewed as having won that state. And I mean, that doesn't mean just minority voters, that means throwing out everybody's vote. One other thing I'd mention about Shelby, which is mischievous, is the federal law, had a formula about how do you decide which states or communities have historically, basically suppressed the vote. That formula was not necessarily based just on old data. And they're in the bill. And then once you designated who fit the definition, then the plea clearance requirements would apply, that you'd have to run by a federal agency any changes. That law basically had in it an escape valve. And that meant that if in 1978, Shelby County was found to have suppressed the vote, they could come to the federal government today and say, we've changed. Here's some data to show that we shouldn't be subject to pre-clearance supervision anymore. Shelby County chose to not do that because they couldn't satisfy that. And the Supreme Court of the United States ignored that escape valve when they said, oh, this data is based on stuff that's very old. And so the Supreme Court literally ignored a large part of that statute. And right now they've said, well, Congress can come up with a new formula. Well, that'll never happen. And so what that means is that it's impossible right now for there to be any federal oversight of state chicanery about elections. So, but there is hope.
there is hope. There is
I'm
hope.
just not sure where it is sometimes. One other thing I might mention, and I'm sorry I could go on, but, Marty, you had mentioned, I believe, and it was Tony mentioned that, there wasn't a lot of examples of difficulties people had. One of my former colleagues was a plaintiff in the Whitford lawsuit that went, Whitford versus Gill, that went before the US Supreme Court. And in the evidence they had, just a couple of examples I'd give you. There was one 80-year-old African-American woman that was born in Arkansas. At the time, she was not allowed to go to a hospital. Her mother wasn't. And so she was born at home with a midwife and had no birth certificate. And so that prejudice 80 years ago prevented her from getting the documents.
Right.
There were other cases where people would have to get a birth certificate to correct something like Tony mentioned. And to, for somebody that doesn't have a computer or internet access to do something like this from Mississippi online, it's like, good luck. And whatnot. And so there was a number of people where it was practically impossible for them to satisfy the requirements. And if that wasn't enough, when Walker passed the requirement to get new driver's licenses, they shut down about half of the motor vehicle department offices around the state. And the ones that were open from like 1 o'clock to 2 o'clock, one day a month.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so, I gotta say this, they're well organized and they have it covered. And when Obama got elected, there was some money that went from some of the right wing, basically think tanks. And they have software that will look and know how everybody voted, every block of every state. And they can draw the maps like playing a computer game. It's really something. And, but like I said, I have to tip my hat to them for organization and funding.
Yeah. Yep. So,
I just wanted to add, I've read, I can't think of great examples right now, but over the last several years, Ben, I've read similar stories of how difficult it is to vote. And I think that they are counting on the fact that most of us, it's not a big deal for us to get a new license, get proof of address, whatever. And that's part of the strategy. So then we don't see the urgency. We think, what's the big deal? Just be a responsible citizen and provide the documentation, not understanding that for a significant portion of the population, it's not so simple. So I think that's part of the design of it, frankly.
Right. Yes, I've heard those comments too, Lori, where people will say, well, you should have your ID. Well, everybody should have their, and then you throw in change of address. I mean, forget it. That's a nightmare to go through. They don't understand the possibilities of barriers to the general population. I think that's a good point. Well, thank you all for coming. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. It was very, very enlightening.
Oh, well, I enjoyed doing it, and it was a pleasure to work with Tony, you're so lucky to have her there, folks. I know you know that.
And Ruth, the wins that we had here yesterday are coming your way.
Yeah,
so
thanks.
you better go in the basement as soon as you sign off.
Thanks, Ben.
That's
Yeah,
right.
that's what I see, the red exclamation point on my computer already. So thank you all. Have a
All right.
wonderful holiday, and
Thank you.
take
You
care.
too.
All right.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Go Badgers.
Good night.
Yeah, there we go. All right. Bye-bye.